Meh. What my cousin didn't know was that I owned the restaurant she was standing in. She said it the way people say things they've rehearsed. Casual, loud enough for the table to hear, quiet enough to deny later. He's always been the slow one. She smiled at her fiancé's mother. Didn't even finish college, you know. I stood in the doorway of the private dining room my family had rented for my cousin's engagement dinner, still in my work jacket, a smudge of grease on my left cuff I hadn't noticed until that moment, and I thought, she has no idea. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I didn't come to that dinner looking for a fight. I came because my mother called me 4 times in 2 days and said my aunt would be heartbroken if I didn't show up. I came because despite everything, despite 23 years of being the family's cautionary tale, the dropout, the one who never applied himself, I still showed up when my mother called. That was the thing none of them ever seemed to understand about me. I was always there. They just chose not to see it. My name is Caleb. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a mid-sized city in Ohio. The kind of place where everyone knows what your father does for a living and uses it to measure you before you're old enough to have done anything worth measuring. My father drove a delivery truck for 22 years. Good man, quiet. He worked doubles when he had to and never complained about it. And when I was 12, he started taking me with him on Saturday routes so I could earn a little pocket money and, I think, so I wouldn't spend too much time alone in my head. I love those Saturdays. Not because of the money, because of the route. We deliver to restaurants mostly. Supplies, linens, specialty products for kitchens that couldn't source them locally. My father knew every chef on the route by name. He remembered their kids' birthdays, asked about their renovations, stayed 15 minutes late to help offload a heavy shipment when a kitchen hand didn't show up. I watched how those chefs treated him, some with real warmth, some with barely disguised impatience, and I started to understand something about how the world was divided. By the time I was 16, I had opinions about restaurant operations that I had no business having. By the time I was 19, I had dropped out of Ohio State after 1 semester. Not because I was failing, but because I had already done the math and the math said I was losing time. My aunt, my mother's older sister, sat at our kitchen table and told my parents I was throwing my life away. My cousin, who was 17 then and already pre-enrolled at a good school out east, watched from the hallway with an expression I had learned to recognize by then. Pity that didn't quite hide the satisfaction underneath. Her name is Renee. She's 2 years younger than me, and she has always, her entire life, been the family's proof that things could turn out right. Good grades, good school, good job, good fiancé. She was not a bad person, I think. She had just been told for so long that she was the standard that she started to believe the rest of us were the deviation. What nobody in my family knew, what I had not told a single one of them, was that in the 8 years since I had dropped out of college, I had built something. It started small. I worked in kitchens for 2 years, any position I could get, learning how restaurants actually function from the inside. Then, I started consulting for owners who were bleeding money they didn't know how to stop losing. Then, I started buying. First, a small breakfast spot that was 3 months from closing. Then, a diner. Then, a gastropub that I turned around in 14 months. I reinvested everything. I slept on a mattress on the floor of my first office for 6 months to keep overhead down. I made mistakes. Real ones, expensive ones, and I fixed them, and the fixing taught me more than the mistakes had. By the time Renee's engagement dinner happened, I owned 7 restaurants across 4 cities. One of them was the place my aunt had rented out the private dining room in for the occasion. She had chosen it because it was the nicest place in town. She just didn't know that nicest place in town had been mine for 3 years. I had not told my family any of this. Not deliberately, not as a strategy, at least not at first. I had stayed quiet because in the early years there was nothing certain enough to share. Then I stayed quiet because the silence had become its own kind of protection. When you grow up being the family's disappointment, you learn that your successes will be minimized before you finish describing them, and your failures will be remembered long after you've moved past them. So I kept my head down, kept building, and told myself I would say something when the time was right. The time had not felt right for 8 years. I walked into the private room that night at 7:15, 15 minutes late because I had been on a call with my operations manager about a staffing issue at one of my locations in Columbus. My mother looked up with visible relief. My father gave me the small nod he used when he approved of something I'd done and didn't want to make a production of it. The room had about 20 people in it. Renee's immediate family, her fiancé's family, a few mutual friends. The fiancé's name was Derek. He seemed fine, a little stiff, the kind of man who has been told he's impressive so many times that he stopped trying to actually be interesting. His mother, who I will call Mrs. Whitmore because that is close enough to her actual name, was seated at the head of the table on the right side, and she had the bearing of a woman who had spent decades deciding what things were worth and categorizing people accordingly. I found a seat near my father and started to settle in. I had been there maybe 4 minutes when I heard it. Renee was leaning toward Mrs. Whitmore, one hand on the table. Voice dropped to a register that was still clearly audible across the room if you were paying attention. She was explaining our family, who was who, what people did. Normal enough. And then she got to me. "That's my cousin Caleb," she said. "He dropped out of college, kind of just drifts around. He works in restaurants." She said it the way you'd say someone collects something slightly embarrassing. He's always been the slow one in the family. Didn't really find his footing. Mrs. Whitmore glanced at me with an expression so briefly dismissive it would have been invisible if I hadn't been looking. Then she returned her attention to Renee and the conversation moved on. I looked at my plate. My mother had not heard. My father had. I could tell by the slight tightening around his jaw, but he said nothing, because that was how he'd been trained by 30 years of keeping the peace at family events, and because it was Renee's engagement dinner and this was not the moment. I understood that. I didn't blame him. What I felt was not anger exactly. I had felt anger about things like this when I was younger. The specific, burning kind that sits in your chest and tells you that you have to prove something, right now, immediately, to everyone in the room. I didn't feel that anymore. What I felt was more like a quiet settling, a kind of stillness that came from having heard this exact note struck so many times that I had finally developed the ears to recognize how hollow it was. She had no idea. I picked up my water glass and noticed, embossed on the base, the small logo of my company's hospitality group. I set it back down carefully. Dinner proceeded. The food was good. I knew the head chef here, had recruited him myself 2 years ago from a restaurant in Pittsburgh that was wasting his talent. The service was smooth. My operations team ran a tight room. I sat through 3 courses and listened to Mrs. Whitmore describe their family's various properties and investments. Watched Derek accept compliments about his career in finance with the satisfaction of a man who had never once had to question whether he belonged at the table. At some point during the dessert course, Derek's uncle, a broad man named Richard, who had been drinking steadily since I arrived, started talking about his own business interests. Commercial real estate, he said. He had properties all over the Midwest. Very selective about tenants. Location is everything, he said. But who you put in the space is just as important. You let the wrong operator in, the whole block suffers. He was looking at me when he said it. I don't know if he meant it the way it landed. I think he probably did. My mother laughed politely and redirected the conversation. I watched her do it, the practiced smoothness of someone who had spent her whole life softening the edges of rooms, and I felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with Richard. After dinner, while people were moving around the room for coffee and dessert, Derek's mother approached me. I could see her recalibrating as she walked over, the way people do when they feel obligated to be inclusive but haven't adjusted their actual assessment. "So you work in restaurants," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "That must be steady work," she said, "in this economy. It keeps me busy." She waited, expecting me to say more, to explain myself, to name a restaurant she might recognize, to offer something she could file in the correct category. I didn't. She smiled with the patience of someone doing me a favor and moved on. My cousin was watching from across the room. When our eyes met, she smiled the way she'd been smiling at me for 20 years. Fond, a little sorry for me, certain of the distance between where she stood and where I was. I stayed another 30 minutes, long enough to have coffee, to say the right things to my aunt about how happy she must be, to shake Derek's hand and tell him welcome to the family. I was almost to the door when my father caught my arm. "You okay?" he said quietly. "Yeah," I said. He looked at me for a moment. He had those eyes that didn't require many words. "You don't have to keep it a secret, you know." "I know," I said. "She'd want to know," he said. "Your mom." "I'll tell her," I said. "Soon." He nodded. We didn't hug. We were not a hugging family, but he squeezed my shoulder once before he let go, and that was enough. I drove home that night thinking about what soon meant. I had been saying soon for 3 years. 2 days later, my general manager at that location sent me a routine operations report, and attached to it, almost as an afterthought, a note. Wanted to flag, there was a billing inquiry from the Whitmore party from Saturday's event. Derek Whitmore's mother called asking for a manager to speak to about a potential booking for their family's company holiday event. They'd like to hold it in the private dining room, same as Saturday. I read that twice. I told my GM to confirm availability and set up a call. The call happened on a Thursday. Mrs. Whitmore spoke to my GM. She asked about menu options, pricing, staffing ratios for a party of 40. She was specific and demanding, and her tone made clear she expected to be accommodated. My GM handled it professionally, gave her the information, and ended the call by saying the proposal would come from ownership directly. My GM emailed me. She asked who the owner was. I said it was a private investment group. She said that was fine. She'd deal with whoever was in charge. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I called my cousin. She picked up on the second ring, surprised but warm. We didn't talk often, but we had never been hostile. The distance between us was comfortable precisely because it was never examined. "Hey Caleb," she said. "I've been thinking about you actually. Derek's mom mentioned she's planning a work event and it's turning into a whole thing." "I know," I said. A pause. "You know? The event she's trying to book," I said. "It's at my restaurant." The silence that followed was different from normal silence. It had weight in it. "What?" she said. "Meridian," I said, naming it. "The place your engagement dinner was at. I've owned it for 3 years. I own 6 others." She didn't say anything for a long moment. I could hear her breathing. "Caleb," she finally said, and then nothing else, because there was nothing obvious to say to that. "I'm not calling to make you feel bad," I said, and I meant it. "I'm calling because it's time for me to stop hiding it, and I thought you should hear it from me first. Why didn't you—" She stopped, started again. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I thought about my father on those Saturday delivery routes. I thought about my aunt at our kitchen table. I thought about the way Renee had looked at me from the hallway when I was 19, and I thought about the way she had looked at me across that dining room 2 days ago. "Because it never felt like it would land the way I needed it to," I said, and I wasn't ready to have that conversation until I was past caring how it landed. She was quiet again. Then, "What did you hear at the dinner?" "Everything," I said. I could hear her inhale sharply, not with indignation, which I had half expected, but with something that sounded more like shame. That was not what I had expected. "I'm sorry," she said. Not immediately, not reflexively. She said it the way people say things they've actually considered. "I didn't know you could hear. Knowing I could hear shouldn't be the variable," I said, gently but clearly. Another silence. "No," she said. "You're right." I told her I wasn't calling to ask for an apology. I was calling because Mrs. Whitmore had requested a meeting with ownership, and ownership was me, and she was going to find out one way or another. I wanted Renee to know first. "Oh God," she said softly. "She doesn't have to find out dramatically," I said. "That's not the goal. I'll handle the booking professionally, same as any client. But I won't hide who I am for the meeting." "She's going to be mortified," Renee said. I didn't respond to that. "Caleb." Her voice had changed. The specific confidence I had heard in it my entire life, the confidence of the one who had gotten it right, was gone. What was left was something younger and more uncertain. "I've been telling that story about you for years. That you drifted. That you were the one who didn't really." She stopped. "I made it a story." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry," she said again. This time it came faster. "I'm genuinely sorry." "I know that too," I said. The meeting with Mrs. Whitmore was scheduled for the following Tuesday. My GM offered to handle it. I thanked him and said I'd take it myself. She arrived at 10 a.m. in the kind of outfit that signals someone who treats business meetings as performances. My assistant brought her to the small conference room off the main dining area. I was already seated when she came in a clean shirt and no jacket, a notebook on the table and a cup of coffee I had not touched. She recognized me the moment she walked in. I watched it happen across her face. The click of recognition, the immediate recalibration, the search for an expression that would be appropriate given that she had, at her son's engagement dinner 3 days prior, described the man currently sitting across from her as steady work in this economy and looked through him like a window. She recovered faster than most people would have. I'll give her that. Mister, she started. Caleb is fine, I said, and gestured to the chair across from me. She sat. There was a beat of silence in which I could feel her deciding how to play it, whether to acknowledge the situation or to behave as though we were meeting for the first time. She chose the latter, I think because acknowledging it would have required a vulnerability she did not know how to perform. She opened her folder and began describing the event. I listened. I asked clarifying questions. I took notes. I was professional, thorough, and did not once reference the engagement dinner or anything said at it. At the end of the meeting, as I was walking her to the front of the restaurant, she slowed near the entrance and said, in a voice stripped of the brisk efficiency she'd been deploying for the past hour, "Renee told us you work in restaurants." "Yes," I said. "I do." She looked at me carefully. "She didn't mention this." "No," I said. "She found out recently." Mrs. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Then, "You built this yourself?" "Yes." She nodded, not warmly exactly, but honestly, the way people nod when they are adjusting their understanding of something rather than simply confirming what they already believed. "That's not easy to do," she said. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." She left. I stood in the entrance of the restaurant I had bought when it was 3 months from collapse. That I had rebuilt staff by staff and service by service into the kind of place my aunt would choose for her daughter's engagement dinner without knowing it was mine. And I thought about easy. Nothing about the last 8 years had been easy, but easy was never what I was after. My mother called that night, Renee had told her. The call lasted 40 minutes. My mother cried twice. Not with sadness, exactly, but with the specific emotion of a parent who has been carrying a worry about their child for years, and has just been told they can put it down. She asked why I hadn't told her, and I said I wasn't ready, and she said she wished she had known, and I said I know. And we stayed on the phone for a while without saying much because sometimes that is what you need from someone who loves you. My father got on the line for the last 5 minutes. He didn't say much. He asked about the Columbus location, which I had mentioned once years ago without context. He had remembered. "It's doing well," I said. "Good," he said. That was the whole conversation. Renee texted me the following morning. 2 sentences. "Derek's mom asked about you all through dinner last night. I think she's going to try to set you up with someone." And then, after a pause, "I've been telling the wrong story about you for a long time. I'm going to fix that." I didn't respond right away. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table with the morning quiet and thought about stories. The ones families tell about each other. The ones that get locked in when everyone is young and impressionable and the adults haven't finished becoming who they are yet. I thought about how those stories calcify, how they start as observations and become verdicts, how the person in the story has to keep proving themselves against a version of themselves that no longer exists. I thought about my father's route, the chefs who remembered his name and the ones who looked through him. The way he showed up anyway, Saturday after Saturday, and did the work with no audience and no recognition and no performance of it. I think that's what I had been doing in my own way for 8 years. Showing up, doing the work. Waiting, not for vindication exactly, but for the moment when the gap between who I was and who they thought I was finally became impossible to ignore. That moment had arrived on its own schedule, the way most real things do. I hadn't orchestrated it. I hadn't planned the dinner, hadn't known my aunt would choose my restaurant, hadn't arranged to be in the same room as Mrs. Whitmore when she tried to book her event. Things had simply caught up with themselves. I texted Renee back eventually. One line, "Thank you, that's enough. I meant it." 3 weeks after the engagement dinner, I told my aunt. I took her to lunch, not at Meridian, at a quieter place nearby, and I walked her through the short version of the last 8 years. She was silent for most of it. When I finished, she looked at me across the table with an expression I had never seen on her face before. "I sat in your parents' kitchen," she said slowly, "and I told them you were throwing your life away." "You didn't know," I said. "I said it like I was certain," she said. "You believed it," I said. "Most people say certain things because they believe them at the time. That doesn't make them malicious." She looked at me for a long moment. You're more generous than I would be. Maybe. Or maybe I just spent enough time in the industry to know that the most expensive mistakes are the ones you refuse to acknowledge. And that acknowledgement, offered cleanly and without excessive drama, is worth more than almost any other currency. I didn't say that to her. They would have come out wrong. What I said was, I just want you to know. That's all. I wanted you to know. She nodded. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over mine in the way that older women in my family have always done when words have run out and something needs to be communicated anyway. Then she picked up her menu and we ordered lunch, and the conversation moved on to other things, the way family conversations always eventually do. I drove back to work with the windows down even though it was cold. I had 2 calls in the afternoon and a site visit in the evening at the Columbus location where we were in the middle of a kitchen renovation. There was a staffing problem at one of the other locations I needed to address by Friday. There was a proposal for a new space I had been sitting on for 6 weeks because the numbers were close but not quite right. There was always more to do. There always had been. I thought briefly about the version of me that Renee had been describing at dinner tables for years, the slow one, the one who drifted, the cautionary tale, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was something almost like gratitude, not for the dismissal itself, but for what the dismissal had required of me. It had required me to build without an audience, to do the work without anyone watching or expecting or waiting to be impressed, to become something real instead of something performed. The verification came later, and it was satisfying in the specific way that late things are, not as sharp as it would have been in the moment, but cleaner, and with less noise around it. I pulled into the lot at my Columbus location just before 5 p.m. My operations manager was waiting outside with a clipboard and a question about load-bearing walls. I got out of the car, rolled up my sleeves, and went to work. That, in the end, is the whole story, or the beginning of the next one. I'm not sure there's much difference.